All right, we're about to roll into part 2 of the talk we had with Chris Milholen. We started it yesterday over from Nets Daily, broke down a ton of stuff around Kyrie Irving, Ben Simmons, Joe Tsai. That was all on yesterday's podcast. Today, we're going to get into Steve Nash and the coaching job that he did this past year. We're going to talk Bruce Brown, Nick Claxton, what those contracts are going to look like. Is there trade value for Joe Harris and Seth Curry? Talk about a ton of stuff with Chris. He's the best. We're going to get into it all. But first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. I want to switch over to Nash here actually a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because you mentioned him, and I'm going to pivot away because I was going to talk players, but now I think this is a good time to bring up Nash. Mm-hmm. You watched Nash this whole year. You know, you covered him. You spoke with him, covering the Nets on a daily basis. You kind of saw the timeline of what Nash went through this season. I have two kind of questions here. One is, do you think, like, how much of possibly of Steve Nash is on the hot seat? And if he is or not, like, what did you see from him over the course of this season? I get, and that's like, that second thing is kind of like more of an opinion, but like, what would you give like the state of Steve, if you had to give the state of Steve Nash right now as the Nets coach, right? Because again, like everything else with the Nets, there's layers here. It's not just binary, good, bad, coming back, leaving. If you had to kind of like sum up the Steve Nash experience this year, what kind of, where would you put it?
You know, it's a unique situation, right? Because it's not one of those you look around the coaching field. Obviously, there's 3 vacancies right now, and you look at the coaching pool and you look at the assistants down the line. Obviously, you'll see within this next week, 2 weeks, a lot of teams are going to request interviews with assistants and stuff. You're going to see that happening. I'll start off with this: if you are going to let go of Steve, you got to do it soon. You got to do it very soon, because the coaching pool is just going to open up. And you want to make sure that you can get all the candidates you want. And one of the candidates, which I don't think will be a candidate, but, you see Steve Clifford rumored in a lot of these moves, a lot of these coaching vacancies. You see him everywhere. But with Steve, going with the hot seat. Steve on the hot seat, I don't see him that much on the hot seat. I just don't, because, with Mark Stein's report, how Kevin talked about him at the end, obviously Kevin's not going to go up there and say, hey, I don't want Steve back. You know what I mean? He's not going to say that. But you just kind of look at what Steve has dealt with. And I know I've said this on multiple times and podcasts. I know a lot of people say I say this a lot. But you look at what Steve has kind of dealt with in the last 2 years. And I'm not saying it's been hard on every coach, especially with COVID. But when you look at what Steve has dealt from 39 starting lineups last year to 43 this year, and then a lot of players, I think it was 17 players got at least one start last year. Or I think it was even more. And then this year, I think it was bordering 20, or it could have been even a little above 20. Then you got the Kyrie Irving thing. Then you got the Ben Simmons thing. And then you got Kevin Durant's injury. If you really look at it, and I know a lot of people always say, well, this guy could have handled it. This guy could have handled it. There's no other coach I could really see that handle it as well as Steve. And I know a lot of people say, okay, well, the transparency didn't follow. I get that point. But at the same time, when you really look at what Steve has kind of been through and dealt with and still got his team, even into the playoffs this year, or even last year, got him to the Bucks and how well they did. And obviously the last year's roster, it was constructed a lot better than this postseason roster. But, it's tough. It's really tough, because it's one of those, obviously, if he gets let go, it's going to be a parting ways situation. It's not going to be a firing. It's going to be a parting ways. And when you look at the head coaching candidates, I guess you could say, Phil Handy sticks in my mind. If you get Nick Nurse, you snag him easily, without a doubt. I don't think Nick Nurse is going anywhere. You look at guys like Quinn Snyder, too. I think Quinn Snyder would be a good fit. I really do, especially because he has that Duke connection as well. And, it's one of those things. I think Steve's going to be around another year, and I think that will be his big year. I think that's going to be the deciding year.
It's funny too, because with him, I totally agree with you. I think sometimes we come off, maybe it's sounding like Nash apologists. It's less about apology, and it's more about, there's just no way to evaluate what's happening here. It's very difficult to evaluate the situation. I think most would agree his X's and O's are not on level with some of the other great coaches in that area. I think that can be fine if you're super elite at other stuff. I think, maybe when you really get down to the nitty gritty, it's a real big problem. But, Nash hasn't done a ton that makes you think super confidently about that. But also at the same time, like you said, with all these different combinations, they started a playoff lineup that had never even played together. Yep. There was 0 minutes. I think it was that Drummond Curry lineup. I like that when they first went out there, the lineup had legit played 0 minutes all season. That's an impossible situation. Like, I don't know what you're supposed. I don't know what anybody is supposed to do with that at that point. So
there's no other coach that could really, like, unless Phil Jackson, prime Laker, like some like magician could put it all together and make it work with connectivity. It's not going to work. And I'm not like a pro Steve Nash guy. And I'm not like, I'm neutral on this thing. Like, the guy's a great dude. Don't get me wrong. But, he was thrown a lot. And, when you get thrown that much and you really dive into not just, like you said, the X's and O's, the adjustments, the out of timeout plays, you could see where the flaws are. And that obviously comes with a rookie. You could still classify him as a rookie head coach. You know what I mean? Because especially last year, you saw D'Antoni's impact. This year, he lost Ime and Mike D'Antoni. He didn't have both of them. He had Jack Vaughn. But you could tell he learned he was really not on his own, but there was a lot that he was kind of dealing with on the coaching side compared to even last year.
And those guys, like, Ime was hadn't been a head coach before, but Mike D had, and it was clear what he brought sort of from an offensive thing. And look, here's the other thing too. On the flip side of it, most people could just have, if you have James Harden, Kyrie Irving, and Kevin Durant on the court together, I suspect you and I at some point, we wouldn't be good, but it would be hard to look terrible.
Yeah, right? it would hardly be looking like a lottery team. Most
right, exactly. So at some point, there's this thing, but that's where it's mostly just for me an incomplete. I don't think he's been dealt a fair hand here. I think at times he hasn't really helped himself, just in terms of not maybe trying to change things. We mentioned the Drummond thing before, Dragic, like there's X's and O scheme things that they couldn't seem to get out of their way with. And at the same time, you kind of say to yourself, well, who could have ddone a lot better here? It's not totally clear. I think I agree with you also that he's going to be the coach this year. And that if it were to end, what'd you say? You said a mutual parting of ways.
It's going to be a parting. It's going to be a mutual parting.
And I don't think anyone would blame him too, because I think you can also say, hey man, this isn't what I signed up for. Like I signed up to be a coach of a basketball team, not to figure out, never know who's going to be able to play and never know who's going to, step on the court or into practice every day. Like that's just not what I'm used to.
I can imagine, sorry to cut you off. I can imagine too that, like, if that did happen, I can imagine too, I don't think Steve Nash would be done. I think he would go to a coaching side, or he might dip down to a player consultant role, like kind of like a similar role to like what he was in Golden State. I can see that too. I don't think he was fully step away from the game.
Yeah, I think I agree with that too. All right, let's talk a little bit of what else we got going on here in this offseason. So we mentioned KD, we mentioned Kyrie. We haven't mentioned KD, but I think we know he's under contract, so whatever.
Yeah.
We mentioned where Kyrie kind of stands here with the Simmons and then Nash. Now they have some other stuff going on that also is going to impact how the rosters play out this year. And let's start with Joe Harris. What do you feel like? So Harris is under contract. He has the most tradable contract probably of any guy, but he just is coming off an ankle surgery that didn't take the first time and then had to roll it back for a second one. Is Joe Harris just kind of fall into this category of these just and he's not like he's not in the same sort of, he's not the same class as Simmons and Kyrie in terms of question marks around availability, but he's coming off an injury. What happens with Joe Harris here? Like, is Joe Harris going to be a net come next year, or is the contract, such that we could maybe see that shopped?
I think the shopping, I think they're definitely going to look into shopping, but do I think that they're going to trade him? It really depends on the deal here. Because you look like you hit it right on the nail there. It's a very tradable contract, but it's also a very friendly contract for a player of his caliber. So you have the two-headed sword right there. Which one do you really want to go with? And obviously, the ankle injuries, the two surgeries, the first time, especially the second time when, they really you could say they botched it. You could say, hey, there was a setback. Regardless, you could say it was botched. So when you look at all those two sides of it, and especially there was no question the Nets needed Joe Harris. You could really floor spacing. You could really, you obviously don't need to even dive into how much the Nets needed Joe Harris in the end of the regular season and the playoffs. It's evident. Anyone that watched Nets basketball knows that. But when you look at what you could command for him and what you could get for him, especially for any type of roster fillings or holes, Like I'm high on Chris Boucher as a signing. I'm very high on him to get him in the free agent. I just really like his game. I love how they could plug in. But when you really look at Joe, it's really a tough thing because at the same time, it's a tradable contract. But what's his value? What's going to be that value? Because teams, like I said before, teams see that he had 2 back-to-back ankle surgeries and played like 9 games this year. And then when you really look at it, if teams dive even deeper, which I don't think will be a factor, but you look at the postseason history, how he's played in the postseason, and you kind of go over that. But I really do think that they're going to shop him. I really do think they are, and I think that they're going to really do their due diligence on shopping. They're not going to be a team that just sends him to any team they want. Because you got to think about this is the longest tenure net on the roster, and there's relationships there. The Nets really made him from. I don't want to. It's disrespectful to say nothing, but it was. He was coming out of the G League at that time, and he made him into a very good player. And at the same time, one of the best shooters in the league, got paid. So it's not going to be one of those deals that I think I see a lot of, like obviously the drafts of trade proposals, everything like that. I think the destination is also going to be very talked about here. I don't think they're just going to ship him for the best option, whatever the case is, unless Joe says yes to that. But I think they're definitely going to do that due diligence on that side of things as well.
Yeah, it's such a shame too because he again we in a season of what ifs. Like Harris is just this other piece where it's like he would have been. I mean, he honestly could have been the difference in like the Celtics series.
Yeah.
He is just that good, and gives them size and length. Even is he a world-class defender? Of course not. But at some point, you just need to be bigger than what the Nets had, and they just lack that size. Or for whatever his deficiencies are defensively. He just is bigger than like Seth Curry and Patty Mills and can shoot as well. And so at that point, like it would have really helped. Let's talk Mills here. Mills has the player option for 6.8. We obviously know that he was instrumental in what the Nets, kind of needed when they were treading water to start the year. I don't think it ended the way that it started, but that's okay. Like he's a veteran. And I think when you look at the whole season, maybe you disagree. I feel like they got everything and more out of Patty Mills. And it just, when he got to the playoffs, it just was what's going to be. And he had already had a ton of miles on him at that point. So he's got the player option. What do you think happens with him? Does he pick up the player option, come back here for 6.8, go shopping it around because he's coming off a pretty, overall pretty good season? What do you think happens here with Patty Mills?
I think he picks up the player option, and you hit it on the nail right there because that's the thing. The guy logged so many minutes. I think you could go into the math. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, or I didn't look at him right now, but I think it was the most minutes of his career. I
definitely was the most minutes of his career.
I think it was that
23:46. I can look at what this career number is. I'm like almost positive it was the most.
I think it's the most there, and at the same time, it's when you add that to a player that I'm not saying. And I guess another underlying factor a lot of people overlook, it's kind of the same thing in the Kevin argument, is that the guy just got off of the Olympics too. He didn't have a real off season here. He had, I think it was a little over a month or a month exact, where it was from the Olympics, where the guy, it's not like he just played in the Olympics. Like the guy made it very far in the Olympics. He got a bronze. So you have that factor as well. And then you log him for so many minutes in the regular season, and then you saw the decline. It's not surprising. A lot of guys thought, okay, he's declining, but everyone kind of knew that it was due to the minutes and obviously his age and just kind of he was taking on more than he's taking on more than what he came in to be. Obviously everyone knows why it really hit every player on the roster, but when you have that price tag to that player option, I think Patty, you could say what you want, especially about that decline with the minutes. But, he was impactful off the court, not just off the court, but in the locker room, fresh energy. He's been there, done that, played with stars. He's obviously Kevin loves the dude. Really just everyone on the Nets really likes the guy. He's one of those guys. So, I would be shocked if he doesn't pick up that player option because when you really think about when you're in that tail end of your career, I think Patty just from, he's talked about, hey, I want to win a championship like here. But in overall, he wants to win a championship. But, I would be shocked if he doesn't pick it up. I think it's one of those things.
23:46 was the 200 more minutes than the most of his career, which was 17-18, and like 700. I mean, way more. 700 more than the year before, 900 more than the year before that. So, I mean, he played effectively, half a season more this year than he played, maybe a little less, like a third of a season more than he played in previous years. So and we saw the miles on it at the end, right?
Oh,
and that's like so predictable. He's an older guy and he played the most minutes. Like, what else do you think is going to happen? They needed him. They needed him so bad at the beginning of the season. He made every shot when they needed him to. And so I put it down.
Wear and tear.
Oh yeah. Like at some point you just can't run anymore. It's anyone that thinks otherwise is silly. All right, we got a couple other guys here, and they're maybe the biggest question marks here, because I think a lot of the guys we went through, I think we can kind of see either it's so cloudy or it's maybe just so easy, like we said with Kyrie and Simmons and these guys, and maybe Harris is tough to trade. But you do have two guys that are up for contracts now in Bruce Brown and Nick Claxton, who, at least with Bruce Brown, we went into this season kind of knew what he could be to some degree after last year. Thought he was going to got paid a little bit, way more probably than, even he probably thought at some point. But then we have this second half of the season, really kind of like near the end. I would call it a breakout from Bruce Brown in terms of how important he was for the Nets, what they needed him to do, sort of this jack of all trades kind of guy. He is now up for an extension. Excuse me. He is up for a new contract. What do you think happens with Bruce Brown? Like, is he a net? Is he just going to cost too much? Did he play himself into an open market that didn't even exist for him last year? Because I think last year there was a lot of question marks around what he could be. I think he actually answered a lot of those in terms of looking at least like a more complete player. Where do you think we stand with Bruce Brown in his future? Like, what happens to him this offseason?
I think the Nets do try to work something. I don't think it's going to be kind of like the last season where, okay, let Bruce Brown fully test the market. And, obviously I wouldn't say obviously overvalued himself, but he was looking for a bigger deal, which made him come back to Brooklyn bet on himself. I don't think it's going to be like that this year. I think this year he's, especially with his postseason, that was the cherry on top of kind of just sweetening up whatever deal he's going to get, whether it's in the 12-15 million range. It could even go a little extra. But, he's going to be an interesting case because the thing is, it's like a lot of teams, especially with the Nets, how they used him this year. Can other teams use him the same exact way? Or how can they kind of utilize his skill set to make them fit in their mold of things? So, you have that aspect to it. It's going to be like, do I think that the Nets are going to go 10 to or 12 to 15 mil? I would be surprised, especially with obviously who they have on the books, like we've been talking about. But at the same time, I think Bruce, especially in his I wouldn't call it, well, you could technically call it an exit interview because the Nets didn't do exit interviews. But after the loss in Game 4, he really spoke. He's like, yeah, I want to come back here. Hopefully, we can work something out. He I'm paraphrasing here, but he kind of really made that clear. So it's going to be interesting. But at the same time, when you have a guy like Bruce that could fill in a lot of holes, it doesn't hurt to bring him back. But at the same time, with the Nets, especially, like we've been talking about with whether you want to kind of connect it with the Joe Tsai losing money, who they have on the books right now, obviously the lack of picks, where does Sean Marks kind of want this to go? Does he want it to really, bring him back and do it that way? Does he move? Does he kind of do some form of unique kind of not wizardry, but kind of gets another pick involved or gets picks or kind of looks at other free agents? Bruce Brown is definitely the most intriguing free agent by far, in my opinion, that's coming up on this Nets roster, without a doubt.
Yeah, and it was crazy, too, for a guy that was effectively buried at the start of the season to play himself into real money. And like I said, we saw some of this last year, but what he did this year was just totally different. It was more complete. He was able to hit the corner threes, at an acceptable level for the most part and some big ones too when they mattered. He just played lights out defense at times, which I knew he was capable. Was definitely able to stay on the court in like high leverage playoff series. That's a lot of boxes to check for a guy, and especially considering his size. So I'm with you. This one is the one that's probably going to drive. Yeah, this one, I agree. I'm with you because this one feels probably more than anything else. Because the other ones, I think, okay, yeah, they signed Kyrie. You don't have to think too much about it. Simmons, he's under contract. You can't trade him, whatever. This is the one where they actually have to make a real decision. Even Patty Mills might just say, hey, I'm accepting the player option. And that's the decision made. like he's on the team.
It's done. Yeah.
This is one where you actually have to, as an organization, really think about what's happening here. I agree with you. This will be the most fascinating one. I'm going to talk to you about Chris. You're Chris. We're talking about Nick Claxton here in a second. Going to talk to our friends over at Rock Auto. This episode is brought to you by Rock Auto. We've been telling you about Rock Auto forever. That's because it's easy. Rock Auto makes it super, super simple to buy car parts, which sometimes can feel very, very intimidating, especially if you walk into those local places. They disappear into the back. They come back with a box. You don't know what's in the box. It may or may not be the right part for your car, especially like me, a do-it-yourselfer. You need to be able to trust that it's the right thing. I know there's been multiple times where I've not felt that, but I've always felt that with Rock Auto. And I also know I'm getting the best prices out there, 30, even 50% better than the chain store. Don't even get me started on the dealership. You can't go to the dealership for your parts, folks. You're just asking to get raked over the coals. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers like you and me for over 20 years, reliably low prices for every customer. They have every part that your car or truck could need. You go to rockauto.com right now, see all the parts available for your aforementioned car or truck. You write locked on in the how did you hear about us box, so they'll know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car or truck will ever need. rockauto.com. All right, let's close it out here. Talking Claxton and some of these other veterans. Claxton doesn't get the start in the Boston series. Maybe he should have. Like we said, I don't think it really mattered too much, but he did have some very high profile issues in the final game of the season where he simply could not make a free throw.
He made a record.
He set a record for, and it didn't end up being this, but I was tracking this along the way. There were times where his missed free throws were like the difference in the point differential for the series. It never got totally to that level, but the fact that I was even tracking it at one point means that it got pretty grisly. That being said, we know he can do switch defending. I think he improved offensively, especially in terms of his decision-making, finishing around the rim. He is up for a new contract. Where do you stand with where the Nets stand on Nick Claxton? Where do you stand on Nick Claxton? What do you think happens with this guy in the offseason?
I think they should really look at re-signing him without a doubt. I think with him, throughout the postseason, especially in the tail end regular season, it was always kind of on Nets Twitter. It was the Bruce Brown or Nick Claxton, right? It was like that. It was like going back and forth with that. With Nick, I say this like everyone, but it's interesting with him, right? Because he's a second round pick. He's restricted. You could really kind of work the numbers here to get a deal done. But at the same time, there's other teams that are going to be interested in him. So I'm wondering if the Nets take the route of, okay, since he is restricted, do they let him test the market, see what he gets, and they can match it? Or do you kind of go up at him first and say, hey, this is what we could give you. Let's work something out. You come back to Brooklyn. Here you go. I think it's going to be the testing the market. I really do think that's what's going to happen. I think that it's kind of I really do think that the Nets are just going to let him test the market. I think they're going to see what he could command from other teams. And, with the luxury of being a restricted free agent, the Nets could match it. But at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if the Nets come at him with a friendly deal to start off with. But, you're not going to find that out, whether he declined something or whatever the case is, unless it was a big deal or something that the Nets want to kind of put out there for some type of obviously leverage or whatever the case is. But I think when you really look at it, I know Toronto has big interest in him. I heard that they tried to get him at the trade deadline. Obviously, I think it was picks and stuff like that. And I didn't hear the intricate details, but I heard from a couple guys that even cover the Raptors and like my guys as well. I contacted, they all kind of connected the dots with the mutual interest there. And I wouldn't be surprised at all, especially when you got like a guy like Chris Boucher who could be leaving too. When you fill him with a guy like Nick Claxton, and the Raptors are known for their development. God, Nick Claxton would be a very good player on the Raptors.
And he fits sort of like what they like in a player. It's like super long, super athletic, not really sure what position he plays, but maybe we can just not the same exact thing. Maybe we could just start 5 of him because they sort of do stuff like that. It's not exactly like that, but they kind of like that guy. Birch,
they love those guys.
Precious Achiuwa, you mentioned Boucher, like those long, rangy, switchable dudes. That is, OG's like this too. He's just better at offense.
Scotty,
Barnes, Siakam, like this is like their guy. This is their sort of archetypal guy. So I could definitely see there being a market for him. But I guess my question here though is, when you look, the other funny thing is about because to some degree this might be answered by the guys who we haven't mentioned yet. Because when you look at this roster, the other guy, I'm just going to group them all together here. Drummond, I don't think he's coming back.
I don't think he's coming back, no.
Then they have Blake and Aldridge, who I mean, maybe they retire. I don't know. Like neither of them were really playing. I know we got miracle minutes out of Blake in the playoffs, but there's a world where all these guys are gone, and they don't have a single big on the roster, right? Yeah. Like, do you think the Nets are looking at it like that with Claxton? Because
I think without, I think so. Yeah. Oh, continue. Yeah. What were you
No,
going to
that's
say?
it. I mean, that was like sort of
mhm.
like ... Like, is that where we are with Claxton too? That they just say, hey, we don't have any other functional bigs at this point because we're going to need to scour the free agent veteran market for just this
Mhm.
kind of guy anyway. So if we have him in the building already, maybe that kind of
Mhm.
answers the question.
Without, yeah, I think you hit it right there. Because that's the thing. Because with Drummond, he can command money somewhere else. He can command more money somewhere else. So I think he's gone. With Aldridge, I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth. Or this is just my opinion. I think that retirement's a big possibility on his end of things. I think that's probably going to be the avenue. With Blake, I wouldn't be shocked at all if he left him on his own. Because especially how the Nets handled his minutes throughout the year and the playoffs, and obviously got falling out of the rotation. You see the likes of him wanting to go back to the Clippers, on Twitter. You see those once in a while. He'd liking tweets of, hey, come back to Lob City 2.0, like all those. You see those as well. I wouldn't be surprised if he's out too. But you made a great point. If all three of those guys leave, who do you have left? And obviously Sharp. That's really it. You got Sharp, and then if you got the 23rd pick in the overall in this year's draft that they can move to 2023 if they really wanted to. And if they do that, they have no picks in this draft. So, that's a good way of looking at it as well. But, even when you look at a front court, they're really a 5 spot that's got Nick and Day'Ron. Obviously, they're going to make a filling there. They're going to have to fill that up with someone. So that's a good way of going about it. But I think with Nick, that's where it's going to come into play, because at the same time, the Nets know that, hey, since he's a second rounder, it's restricted. I don't know exactly how those numbers work, but it doesn't have to be kind of a really tenacious deal where he's gonna command a lot of money here. I really do think that they could meet in the middle ground, make it a friendly deal, kind of somewhat similar, not money wise and obviously year wise to Joe, but structured kind of like that to a player like his caliber and his experience. I think it could be a team friendly deal, but at the same time, Claxton could be making the money that he wants to make.
So funny about the Nets. Maybe we just cap it off with this too, because the Nets are just one outside of Durant. The Nets seem to be packed with players that really only have value to the Nets, or like they need to create, they need to make their own value to the Nets because they will not command that same kind of value to anybody else. Like it's really just it's freaking down the line. It's for all different reasons, right? It's like Kyrie, it's been the theme sort of like of every guy I've basically talked to everyone except for Seth Curry, which I don't think we need to discuss. He's going to be back on the team. I guess he's a super tradable contract. Maybe he gets traded. I don't know, whatever.
He's my most tradable player on this roster.
Oh, 100%. Well, I think we should have mentioned him too, because and just round back on that, there's two ways to look at this. It's either you feel like you have him at a great deal, which you kind of do for what he can do. Just like shoot lights out. We saw a little off the dribble stuff. And then the other way, the reason you have him on a great deal is because he would be super valuable to somebody else. Like if you could swap him for a wing or something like that, I think the Nets would do it in a second.
Oh, without doubt.
Yeah, but okay. So let me just ask. Well, maybe we'll close on this. Like, do you think he's packaged this summer? Oh,
I think he's the most packaged out of any guy. I really do think, because it's like when you look at who, like I mentioned before, what the Nets have to do trades with compared to obviously Seth's deal. They know what every team knows what they can get out of him. He's one of those players that his skill set kind of really fixes in, because he's a shooter at the end of the day. He could do much more than being a shooter. Obviously, we saw the mid range, the cutting. And obviously, the defensive side of things, you could talk about it from that point of view, but that's really any shooter that really comes with it. But I think he's the most packaged player on this team. I do think he does get traded. I really do think it's going to be surprising how it works out. I think if they do deal him, I think it would probably end up being a draft day deal. I think that's where it fits the mold here. I think it's kind of like a Landry Shamet 2.0 thing. I think that could kind of, not obviously the same way the deal is structured, but it would be a draft day deal, what they did with Landry Shamet, kind of something like that. But at the same time, they don't have any picks. So do they go with the picks and kind of see whatever the kind of how the draft is? There's been mixed reviews about this NBA draft, especially outside of the top 15 picks. But, if I really had to make a decision here, I don't think Seth and Joe are going to be out. I think it's going to be one of the two. I don't think it's going to be both. But, I think out of really anyone on this Nets roster, I think Seth Curry is definitely the most tradable asset on this team.
So funny about that too, because Nets fans, I think will probably react correctly in that they'll say, oh, that's tough to lose him because he was really instrumental and good for them. But then you got to remind everyone, like, that's why he's tradable. That's why these other guys aren't tradable because they are huge, massive question marks.
Exactly. Like you could do a thing where it's Seth and Cam Thomas, or Seth, you could combine some pieces here. I think Cam Thomas could also be somewhat valuable to a team, But at the same time, like you just mentioned, Seth Curry's good. A lot of people are going to miss him when he's gone. But at the same time, that's why he's the most tradable asset, because the other teams know what they can get out of him.
Exactly. So you can't get something out of nothing. You got to remind people this all the time. This is, you got to give something to get something short of, or sometimes you got to give something in Harden and get nothing back with Simmons, but it can go the other way too. All right. Chris Milholen, he's been awesome for us. 2 episodes worth of stuff here. Really, really appreciate it. He's over there at Nets Daily. He's back on Twitter, everybody. So no worries there at Chris Milholen.
Not selling PS5s anymore.
Probably spend half the podcast on that part of it. No, you can make sure you go follow him at CMilholen SB. I'll put that in the show notes over on Twitter. Chris, thanks so much for jumping on. Probably talk to you maybe beginning of next season once we have how all the rest of this stuff shakes out. Really appreciate it, man.
Of course, brother. You know where to find me. You know how to reach me. Always down to chop up hoops with you. You're the man. And yeah, dude, always a fun time.
Oh, man. Should I have you on more? Just end every podcast saying nice things about me. All right. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.